Hi, hey guys, welcome back here to another video. I promised you guys yesterday that I would make a
and the
video
government did try to uniform them. So while you do see some of the men are wearing a smattering outfits, they're wearing civilian clothes, there is a small group closest to you that's wearing green uniforms with blue trousers. They wanted to ensure that these men would be identified out on the battlefield because they understood that the enemy was fielding militia as well. The Americans relying heavily on militia during 1812 and 1813. And their militia typically showed up in civilian clothes too. And just like today, there isn't much of a fashion difference between a gentleman from New York and one from Ontario. So to help try to identify them from battle to battle, they would find small ways. For example, during the siege of Fort Erie, the New York State Militia had red hat bands and armbands, in hopes that they'd only get shot at by one side.
Over here, Battle's trying to creep up.
As the troops are moving across the field, they're using light infantry tactics. Out on the open field, when you're skirmishing, you don't want to be in those big clumps like you normally see in the movies or in textbooks. You want to be spread out. This allows you to cover more ground, makes it harder for you to be hit, and sure, it makes it harder for you to hit the enemy. But the idea was that skirmishers were to harass. They were not meant to win battles. The Americans, though, had a slight advantage in this in some battles. If you notice in the American line, blue with red fringe coats down there, those are men representing soldiers of the Kentucky militia, and they are armed with rifled muskets. Pretty much every musket out on the field today is a smoothbore, which means at 100 yards it can miss its intended target up to 9 feet in any direction. No rifling means the musket ball just bumbles its way down. But the rifles have the rifling grooves that give the ball a spin as it comes out, sending it straight into the target, much like how quarterbacks throw footballs. And while this makes it significantly more accurate, the longest confirmed kill during the war being 405 yards during the siege of Fort Meigs in Ohio, it does make them harder to load. And as a result, riflemen usually were supported by men with muskets, simply because they were faster and easier to load. You could give them protection. If you do see some of the militia
Can I go over there where everybody's sitting down?
Was the pinnacle of military technology. These as I mentioned, they're inaccurate. So the idea of having a group of men fire in one direction is somebody hits something, even at 200 yards away, you can hit something that way. But it also counteracts the other problem. That is, they don't always work. As you're watching, every once in a while you're going to notice the muskets go click instead of bang. That's because the flintlock mechanism, anything can make it go wrong. You could have a gust of wind, a little bit of humidity, maybe the powder in your pan fell out. I could go on for quite some time about that, but suffice to say, about 20% of the time, they don't work. So by firing in a mass group, the hope is not only will you possibly hit something at 200 yards away, somebody had a working gun. And if you're in that mass group, while you're fixing the problem, there's lots of other soldiers that can keep firing. So this was the standard doctrine at the time, and it worked. But it did produce one final problem, which leads to the most popular question. Why on earth did the British walk onto an open battlefield in bright red with a white shoot me here X across their chest? And that is because they only want to get shot at by one side. You can see from the fighting here, just a couple muskets, how much smoke they can produce. Imagine, at some of the larger battles, how thick that smoke would get after a few volleys. The Battle of Lundy's Lane, you had close to 6,000 muskets out on the battlefield. It did not take long for the smoke to become so thick that the first you would see your enemy is about 20 paces away. So in that thick, smoky atmosphere, you didn't care about camouflage. You cared about making sure when your troops saw you, they didn't shoot. So the British, bright red. The Americans, bright blue. Red team, blue team, Leafs, Habs. If you thought you were smart and you showed up wearing camouflage, if you're wearing green or brown, anything like that, unfortunately, you're probably going to get shot at by both sides. And that was extremely common. During the Battle of Stoney Creek in the dark, it was noted that the American forces in confusion fired upon themselves several times. And at one point, a cavalry unit charged in the darkness, started slashing away, only to discover to their horror they had charged into friendly troops. Now, don't think the British weren't subject to this as well. At the Battle of Lundy's Lane, a Canadian regiment, the Glengarry Light Infantry, wearing a green uniform, lost more men to the British than to the Americans. If you don't know the man in front of you, shoot him. At least that way you get to survive. Now, we do have an excellent opportunity to point out some of the British officers that are out on the field. You can see a couple of them out in the center here with their nice scarlet coats.